Welcome to video 5 of the Search for a Better Health series. In this video, we're going to be talking about the different types of pathogens and how we can distinguish between those. And then we're going to do a quick overview of malaria, but that was part of your research task for the holidays. So the 6 that we're going to learn about are prions, viruses, bacteria, protozoans, fungi, and macro-parasites. And then I'm going to give you a few examples of some different diseases that can be caused by those pathogens. If we look at the word pathogens, we can break them into two main categories, microscopic or macroscopic. So we're talking about microscopic, something we cannot see with with the naked eye, and then macroscopic, things that we can see with the naked eye, and then we can see that how they break on further down that chart. First example are prions, and there's some proteins that have been altered due to a mutation. And we can see here in the diagram the normal protein compared to the infectious prion protein. And the way which people can contract prions are the use of contaminated implements during surgery. We can eat tissue containing infectious prions. So that usually happens if we don't cook meat properly. And then some people also inherit the mutated gene. Because of this change in the shape of the protein, the prion proteins now stick together and they can form long fibers that are toxic to nerve cells. So that's why we have diseases such as mad cow disease in cattle or the Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in humans, where they sometimes refer to as the brain is becoming spongy because there are holes in it, and that's because of these fibers being toxic. We then move on to viruses, and they're particles which are between 30 to 300 nanometers, and they contain genetic material which are able to pass on hereditary information, and they can be crystallized. So a virus, we can see on the diagram on the left, are made up of a protective protein coat, and that encases the genetic material. We can reduce the prevalence of viruses from vaccinations, and that's our current method of reducing the incidence of these. And we have some diseases such as smallpox, measles, influenza, and AIDS, which can be caused by viruses. And viruses, one of their main characteristics is that they can only replicate inside a host. So they can't live outside organisms. Only when they live inside these cells are they able to survive to reproduce. So it can attach itself to a host cell. And we can see here that it injects its nucleic acid. So it's genetic information. The cell then makes copies of this viral DNA. This then tells the cell to make these proteins that the virus requires. And then we can see here that the new virus becomes assembled. Then we see the cell burst and releases the new virus to then overtake more cells, thus continuing this cycle here. We then move on to bacteria, which are larger than viruses, and they're prokaryotic cells that can live freely, but they can cause serious disease. They contain, again, genetic material, which is a single large chromosome, and they reproduce by asexual reproduction due to the process of binary fission. So the bacteria that is in fact harmful to organisms can produce toxins or chemicals that harm the host, and some such diseases include tetanus, pneumonia, tuberculosis, and chlamydia. We then move on to protozoan, which are single-celled eukaryotic organisms. They are bigger than bacteria, and the way which we classify them is based on the way that they move with their flagellum, which we can see here. Again, they reproduce by binary fission, and we have some diseases like malaria, trypanosomiasis, dysentery, and giardiasis. We then move on to fungi, which are eukaryotic unicellular organisms. They produce or they possess a cell wall, but they do not photosynthesize. And they can range from microscopic to macroscopic. And most of the fungi, which we term pathogens, are dermatophytes, and that means that they live on skin, nails, and hair. The reproduction varies between sexual and asexual, and the way in which they are transmitted, or they continue to reproduce by these hyphae that produce fruiting bodies which contain spores, and when they spread these spores, that's how this fungal particles are spread around. And we have things such as ringworm, tinea, and mold. And then we look at macro-parasites, which are broken down into endoparasites or ectoparasites. Um, Macro-parasites are the first ones that we've talked about, which are visible to the naked eye. All the ones in the previous slides are all microparasites or microorganisms. We term endoparasites those that live inside a host body, so flatworms and roundworms, and then ectoparasites are anything that live on the outside of the body. And then some of these ectoparasites can also be vectors which transmit pathogens. When we talk about malaria, it is in fact caused by Plasmodium falciparum, which causes 95% of all malarial cases, and then we've got Plasmodium vivax, which is the other 5%. And the way in which it's transmitted to people is by a vector, which I just mentioned, and that vector is in fact the female Anopheles mosquito, and it injects this Plasmodium while feeding on blood. Ronald Ross discovered the parasite in the stomach of an Anopheles mosquito, and this discovery by Ronald, in fact, disproved the thought that malarial parasites can be found in the bloodstream. So here we see the reproductive cycle, or the way in which malaria is transmitted through people. So we can see here that there's fertilization inside the mosquito, which can then it migrates, so the zygote migrates. Any larvae migrate to the salivary gland, which then injects these larvae into the human again when the mosquito feeds. We see asexual multiplication in liver cells, enters the red blood cells, and then we can see here that it in fact does take over the red blood cells. And this can produce symptoms such as chills, fever, muscle pains, and nausea. In terms of treatment and prevention, there are a few treatments, so medications that are quite common, and then we can have some preventative mechanisms. So we see quinine is one of the most common, but then in terms of prevention, we're in fact trying to prevent the mosquito from biting people. So we're making sure that people have bed covers and then use a bug spray with DEET. And in fact, the World Health Organization has a goal, which is to reduce mortality from malaria through through providing people with bed nets, medicines, and the spraying of mosquitoes and their breeding sites. That does in fact conclude video 5. Make sure you tune in for video 6.